Well, let me encourage you to reach into your bulletin and you'll find our outline for this morning. I'm going to huff and puff. You're familiar with that from the nursery rhyme of the Three Little Pigs. We're going to talk about how we can manage our anger. What can we do? What are some techniques that we can employ in our life? What does it mean to be angry? Is there good anger and bad anger? Does anger always cause within us a problem, or can it be used in a constructive way? We're going to be talking about that this morning. Let me tell you a quick story. General Lee was traveling shortly after the Civil War ended, and as he was traveling through the countryside, some people heard that he was coming near their town, and he was invited to come stay at some people's house. And as he got there, he noticed that in front of the house was this tree that was barely living. It had musket shot balls all in it, and it had been on fire at one time, and it was just a mutilated tree. And when Grant got to it, the lady of the house came out and met him, and she said, "General Lee, do you see that tree?" And he goes, "Yes, that tree's seen a lot." And she goes, "Yes, that was all done by the Union Army, and I keep that tree there as a reminder of how I hate them and how I'm angry with them." And it's told in the story that General Lee said to her, "Ma'am, just cut down the tree and forgive." Anger, it can take control of us. It can cause us to be a people who just relive something over and over and over again. It becomes, if you will, kind of a habit, and we just get used to it. It's not a matter of do we think whether it's right or wrong. It just becomes part of who we are. Think of that woman. The Civil War's over, but I'm going to be angry every single day. Every time I walk out of my house, every time I see that tree, the only thing that's going to come to my mind is bitterness, is anger. We don't want to live like that, do we? We don't want to be that type of people, do we? Well, we have to understand what the Bible says about anger. We're going to look at two different types of anger this morning. We're going to look at anger that is condemning. There's no good in it. It doesn't build us up. It doesn't help us to be better Christians. It doesn't help us with those around us, our brothers and sisters in Christ. It's an anger that is always condemning, never redeemable. Then the second type of anger, and this may surprise you, is what we would call righteous anger. And this is an anger that takes over us when we see some type of wrong taking place, when we see something that ought not to be right, when we see as a Christian those things that are opposed to Christianity, those things that are opposed to the Godhead. And it's this type of anger that rises in us where we want justice to take place. And we want a good resolution out of whatever the situation may be, but we rise to the point of anger. Is that good? Is that acceptable? Does the Bible say anything about that type? Well, we're going to look at it. I want you to notice, first of all, in your outline, that anger that we would call condemning anger. Turn over to Matthew chapter 5 and look at verse 22. Again, this is anger that's never good. It says this in Matthew 5:22, "But I say to you," Jesus is the one who's speaking here, "but I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause," now we're going to come back and deal with that a little bit later, the without a cause. But he says this, "But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,' shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says 'you fool' shall be in danger of hellfire." It's anger. I'm mad. I'm upset. There isn't anything in here that's producing in me something that would be good. We lose a little bit in the translation here when it comes to that word "raca," and usually 9 times out of 10, right, we just pass right through it and don't think about it. This is a type of anger that's given to somebody that isn't good. It's a spiteful, hateful anger. In fact, one of the root words of "raca," and I found this very interesting, one of the root words of "raca" means to spit. So angry, have you heard that saying? I'm so angry I could just spit. This is the type of anger that we're talking about here, that Jesus is talking about. It's a condemning anger. Here's another one. Go over to the Gospel of Luke. Go to Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. And I want you to look at verse 28. Again, Jesus is saying this. It says, but he was angry and would, this is the brother of the prodigal son. The prodigal has come home. His father's thrown a feast. The other brother hears about it, and he's not happy. And even though he could go into the feast, he does this in verse 28. But he was angry and would not go in. Therefore his father came out and pleaded with him. I'm mad, Dad. I'm not going to participate in what's going on inside that house. I don't want anything to do with my brother. I know what he's done. I know what type of person he is, and I know how he's harmed this family. I'm not going to go in. He's angry. The father comes out and tries to plead with him, but he doesn't get anywhere. He doesn't make any headway. This is that type of anger that says, here I am and I'm not going to move. I'm not going to be reasoned with. I don't want to hear what your explanation is. I don't want to hear what you have to say. I'm just so mad. It's a condemning anger. Go over to Galatians, if you will. Go over to the letter of Galatians. Look at chapter 4, beginning in verse 5. This is condemning anger, right? It says that Galatians chapter 4, I said 5, didn't I? Galatians 4, beginning in verse 5. That's not the right one. Galatians 4. Well, skip down to Colossians 3 in verse 8. Colossians 3 and verse 8. It says this. It says, but now you yourselves are to put off all these, right? The Christian you're supposed to be, the person you're supposed to be. But now you yourselves are to put off all these things. The first thing that's mentioned, anger. But it doesn't stop there. Wrath, which comes from anger. Malice, which has anger in it. Blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. All of those have their origin in anger. All of those are an outgrowth of anger. And when Paul is writing to the church in Colossae, he says, listen, I understand that these things are there. It's never denying that they're there. I understand that these things are there. But in Paul's instruction to them, he says, listen, I think you need to deal with these things. And what I think you need to do is you need to put them off. We would say today, you need to get rid of those things. You need to move past. I've had a fella come into this is years ago. He came into my office and he said, I'm really upset with this friend of mine. I think he did me wrong. I think that he knew better, and I really think that he did it intentionally because he knew it would harm me, and I'm just so mad at him. It just consumes me. And I talked to him for a little bit, and then I learned something. I said, how long have you been angry with this person? When did this happen? Thinking it was recent. He says, about 25 years ago. You've been that angry for 25 years. You've been so wrapped up. You know what? That would be a consuming anger. It just raged in that person's life for all of those years. Paul says there comes a point when, listen, you got to put it off. That's a condemning anger. Go over to James. Go over to James, the epistle to James. I want you to look at James chapter 1 and beginning there in verse 19. James chapter 1 and verse 19. It says this, so then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear. We're good with that. Slow to speak. Yeah, I've got to think about my words. And slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. There is no way that we can take... Now, remember, we're talking about condemning anger. We'll deal with righteous anger. We're talking about that type of anger that isn't good in our life, that eats us up. Remember that man that consumes us. Remember that fellow I tried to counsel. It just consumes who we are. And here you begin to see another outgrowth of that condemning anger. He says you need to be swift to hear and slow to speak and slow to wrath. And then he talks about how wrath or anger can lead us. It says, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Now, we know that God wants a Christian to produce righteousness. None of us will argue against that. But what Paul does say is that we can give ourselves over to a type of anger that we can never make the claim that this is the righteousness of God. Paul says you can't do that. This is a condemning anger. Let me give you one more. Turn back in your Old Testament to the book of Proverbs. Look at Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 18. Proverbs 15 and verse 18. It says, a wrathful man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger always contention. So we need to understand, we need to be a people that when it comes to anger, we understand that it can stir up in us that which isn't to our benefit or to the benefit of others. Again, we're talking about condemning anger. Nothing good is going to be produced from this type of anger. It's not going to bring us closer in our relationship with God. It's certainly not going to bring us closer in our relationship to one another. And it's not going to give us peace and quietness in our life. It's always going to be turmoil. Right? It's always going to put us on edge. It's always going to be that adrenaline that's flowing through our body that has this wrath just building up and building up and building up. Think of a teapot. Eventually that water reaches the point where it boils so much, it sends off that little whistle. It boils to the top and it releases it. It's just all churned up. And that's how anger can be. It boils and boils till it's released. And when we talk about condemning anger, it doesn't release itself in anything that's righteousness. We already saw that. It doesn't release itself from us in anything that's going to be beneficial to us in our relationship with God. It's condemning anger. But there's another anger that's mentioned in the Bible as well. And it's what we would call righteous anger. Go over to Matthew chapter 5. I told you we would come back to this. Look at Matthew chapter 5. And again, verse 22. And here you have Jesus talking. He says this, but I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause. Now, isn't that interesting? That Jesus goes on and he talks about how you're in danger of hell because of that unmerited anger, but he does begin with there are times when we are angry with one another. There's times when we have this, what we would call this righteous anger. Look at it in 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 13. It's where Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, says of the man who's having a relationship with his father's wife, he says, expel the immoral brother, kick him out, put him out. Now, do you think Paul said that with a happy tone? Do you think Paul said that with just, oh, well, it kind of doesn't matter? Or do you think Paul wrote that with righteous anger? This brother is leaven in the church, and it's bad leaven, and the best thing that the church can do, put him out. That's righteous anger. Anger that seeks to do the will of God. I know that sounds odd, but we're going to see it. Anger that says, listen, there's a wrong that's being done here and a right needs to fix it. There needs to be some type of action and that's what that anger, righteous anger, seeks to do. It seeks to produce that which ought to be done, that which will always be good. Go over to Mark. You're in Matthew. Go over to the Gospel of Mark. I want you to look at chapter 3, and we're cutting into something here, but I want you to look at verse 5. 3 and verse 5. You can go back. This is Jesus being questioned about the Sabbath. In verse 4, then Jesus said to them, is it not lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they kept silent. This is the religious leaders. And when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. Jesus looks at these religious leaders, and he's angry. You mean to tell me that you don't think that good should be done today? You mean to tell me that if a person could be healed, you're telling me that because it's the Sabbath, they ought not to be healed? And when he looks at these people, it's righteous anger. Why are you thinking this? Why are you teaching this? How in the world did you ever reach the point where you reach the conclusion in your mind that if something is good and godly and beneficial, well, don't do that. Let something go undone. Jesus looks at them with righteous anger. I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe you're twisting your relationship with God and what he wants us to do. It's righteous anger. Go to John. Go to the Gospel of John. Look at chapter 2. Chapter 2, and look at verse 13. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand. Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he hadn't done anything yet, but you know something's coming. He's making a whip. Now, when he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." You've turned it into a business. You've left it from being the temple of God where God is worshipped, and it's nothing more than an extension of what you do out there in the world. You sell these animals for sacrifice. You make change for money for people, and you're doing that in the holiest place in Jerusalem, and he's angry. But it's a righteous anger. You're violating what God said was acceptable. You've given yourself over to something that was wrong, and he's not going to wait. He's not going to step back and say, well, you know what, maybe I'll just give them a sermon. He acts, a cord made into a whip, driving the people out. This isn't right. It's righteous anger. Well, what about us? What about us? Can we have righteous anger? Can we have the same type of anger that Jesus had? I think we see that in 1 Corinthians 5. But we also see it in Ephesians 4. Turn over there. Turn over to Ephesians chapter 4. And I want you to notice verse 26. Ephesians 4 and verse 26. It says this, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. Be angry and do not sin." How is that possible? Well, Brother Don, you mentioned Luke 15:28. That's condemning. Galatians 4, or Colossians 3 and verse 8, and that's condemning. James 1:19 and 20, and that's condemning. Matthew 5 and verse 22 has a component of it that's condemning. How in the world then can you say that this type of anger can be right? Because it's righteous anger. Be angry in a righteous sense. A wrong is being done here. This isn't right. This shouldn't be happening. The gospel of Christ is being mutilated, and that makes me have righteous anger. The church is being attacked each and every day, and that gives me this righteous anger. I see people, instead of turning to God, instead of loving God, instead of embracing him and being forgiven of their sins, I see them accepting evil. And that anger, that righteous anger rises in me. What does it produce? Not that which is ungodly, but that which is godly, that says, I want a good to take place here. Let me teach. Let me encourage. Let me offer correction. It's that anger that moves us in a relationship that strengthens us in our relationship with God. You see it there. Be angry, but do not sin. Have the right type of anger. Go to Psalm chapter 7. Turn back to your Old Testament. Psalm chapter 7. And look at verse 11. Verse 11, God is a just God, and God is angry with the wicked every day. That's a righteous anger. That's God identifying who this righteous anger is with. He says it's with the wicked. I'm angry with the wicked. I'm angry with the ungodly. I'm angry with those who aren't doing the very thing that they know to do right. These people are not ignorant. These people understand that God is calling them to live in a certain way. But it's God's righteous anger who says, I'm going to act. I'm going to do something. I'm not going to stand by. And he's angry with the wicked. In verse 12, if he does not turn back, he will sharpen his sword. He bends his bow and he makes it ready. I'm going to kill him. It's a righteous anger. I'm going to take this step because what they're doing isn't good and it's only going to lead to harm. So I'm going to step in as the righteous judge. Righteous anger. Let me give you one more. Go to Psalm. Stay there in Psalms. Go over to Psalm 139. And I want you to notice, I believe it begins in verse 19. It does. It says, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked." This is the psalmist pouring out his heart. "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, you bloodthirsty men, for they speak against you wickedly. Your enemies take your name in vain." And then he's going to talk about himself. He's going to make it personal. He says, "Do I not hate them, O Lord, that hate you?" He's angry. He says, "And do I not loathe those who rise up against you?" He's angry. He says, "I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies." It's righteous anger. It's the psalmist saying, "God, I'm on your side. God is just. God is good. God always does what is right. God is the very essence of what is right, what is pure, what is holy." And when this psalmist sees how God is being treated, he says, "God, I know your anger burns against him. I know you're not happy with these people. And just the way you're angry with them, well, then I'm angry with them. And just the way that they're being condemned, I'm going to condemn them." It's a righteous anger. I like what he says beginning there in verse 23. I think he's making a transition, but I like what he says. "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties. See if this is righteous anger. Look inside my life. See if I'm not defending you." You've been there. I know you have. You've heard the Lord's name taken in vain, and oh, here it comes. You see a wrong being done to individuals, oh, here it comes. You see the denominations, getting credit for this and credit for that. You see the denominations, they're growing and growing, and that righteous anger begins to rise within you. And you say, "I've got to do something. I've got to teach people. I've got to preach the gospel. I've got to reach out to my friends and family. I've got to do something because I'm angry with these people." And then you encounter those to this very day, just like the psalmist is saying, that they hate God. They don't love God. They don't want anything to do with God. And that righteous anger begins to rise in you. And you say, "I can't agree with these people. I can't be on their side. I can't say that what they're doing is acceptable." And there's that righteous anger. There it is, right? And it begins to come out. Is it just? Well, sure, it's just. Is it acceptable to God? Yes, it's acceptable. Now listen, you look at those lists. Surely you can tell the difference between a condemning anger and a righteous anger. It's not hard. One is rooted in man, condemning, and one is rooted in God, righteous. Well, what do we do with all this? Right? What should you do? What's the end result? How do you put it all together? Well, let me give you 4 quick things of how you can manage your anger. Here's the first one. You should think before you act. Go over to Proverbs. All of these are going to be in Proverbs. Look at Proverbs chapter 15 and look at verse 1. You should think before you act. "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." I've been there with condemning anger. I've been so mad that the first thing that came out of my mouth was not a soft word. It was an angry word. How can I control that? Well, I can control it by thinking before I act. Is how I'm going to respond, is what I'm going to say. Is it just being said out of anger, or am I understanding that I need to think before I speak? I want to make sure I say the right thing, right? You should think before you act. Here's a second thing. You should be slow to anger. Go over to Proverbs, or stay in Proverbs, and look at chapter 14, Proverbs 14, and notice verse 29, down there towards the end. It says, "He who is slow to wrath has great understanding, but he who is impulsive exalts folly." I like this verse because it defines for us, of course, righteous anger, and it puts 2 important words together in verse 29, wrath and understanding. So he who is slow to wrath has great understanding. I'm going to look at this situation. I'm going to make sure I understand the situation. I'm going to make sure that when it comes to me and the decision I'm making, that it's not a type of condemning anger. No, it's a righteous anger, and in that way I want to respond. So I'm going to be slow. I'm going to look at the situation. I'm going to see all the different complexities are in it, and then I'm going to decide. You should be slow to anger. Here's a third thing. You should remember the consequences of anger. Turn over Proverbs chapter 29. Proverbs chapter 29. Look at verse 22. Proverbs 29, verse 22. An angry man stirs up strife, and a furious man abounds in transgressions. Well, that's not good. I don't want to abound in transgressions. I don't want to stir up strife. I don't want to make a situation any worse than it could possibly be. I know in righteous anger, those who are feeling that anger aren't going to be happy. They're not going to be pleasant because there is a reason to be angry with them. But I want to make sure that there's consequences long term for anger. And I don't want my anger to stir up strife. And I don't want my anger to turn around and abound in transgressions. I don't want to sin. I don't want to sin. If my anger is anything other than righteous, then it's sin. Then it's sin. And I'll give you one more. And this may sound odd. Go to Proverbs 20. Well, you're 29. Just turn backward a few chapters. Look at Proverbs chapter 22. And this might seem odd to you. Look at verse 24. But I think it has a relationship to us and whether or not we give ourselves over to condemning anger or righteous anger. All the anger that we've looked at so far is that anger that leads us in these four things, is that anger that can lead us into doing something that's not good. And so here we see that we should avoid angry people. It says this, make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go. Why not? Because it's not going to produce anything that is good in our life. You know angry people? I mean, people, you would say it like this. You'd say it like this. That guy or lady, we'll be fair. We'll throw the women under the bus also. That person is angry with the world. Right? You ever said that? You see people like that? Or, oh, here comes Brother Stan. Brother Stan's the angriest man I know. All he does is fuss and fume. There's no kindness in him at all, right? How many times have you, when you were growing up, that seems like every street has the angry person at the end of the road, right? They're always, don't go to their house, whatever you do, stay away from them. They're just that angry person that's always on the block, right? That one person at work, oh, Jim, he's angry about everything. I've never heard that guy say a pleasant thing. You know what I'm talking about. These people that all they do is they excel in one thing, anger. It's like it's their spiritual gift from God. God just gave me the ability just to hate everything and everyone, and it's what I do. Don't hang out with a person like that. Don't let a person like that, whose anger is uncontrolled, have an influence on you. And listen to me, it will have an influence on you. Mama was right when she wanted to know who you were hanging out with when you came home from school and you say, I'm going out to play. And Mama said, who are you playing with? She was right because she knew they were going to have an influence on you. And it's the same thing with us. We want to be a people who understand that there's a time for righteous anger. And when we understand that, we act on it. But this person here, he's just a fool. He's just angry at the world and everything. And he doesn't even want to try to have peace or have something good or happy in his life. That'll affect you. It really will. Now, I know that you can sit down and you can go to your concordance and you can look up the word anger and you can find everything, anger, wrath, all kinds of different words that represent the same concept. They're all throughout the scriptures, and you'll be able to see very clearly those that contain anger that's not good, condemning, and those that show anger that is good because it's righteous. Right? You'll be able to make the difference between those. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter if you can tell the difference if you're not going to choose what is right. I know the difference. Well, then which one are you going to choose? I know one's good and one's bad. Great. Then which one are you going to choose? I know that one has a good result and I know that one has a bad result. Great. I'm glad you know it. Which are you going to choose? So I ask you, which type of anger are you going to choose? If we can encourage you this morning, we would love to do that. Maybe you'd like us to pray for you, pray with you. We're a praying church. We'd love to do that. You might be here this morning and you're not a New Testament Christian, or you might be watching over the internet and you're not a New Testament Christian. Friends, you can be. The gospel plan of salvation is to hear, believe, repent, confess and to be baptized. And if an individual has not done that, then they're not saved. And man needs to be saved. If we can help you in any way, come forward as we stand and sing.